1943, The Battle of the Midway by Capcom. 1943, the sequel to a little-known shooter, a little popular ditty in the mid-80s called 1942. It was actually originally released in December 1984. Home versions were ported to the Nintendo Famicom in Japan a year after that, in 1985, and it was finally ported to the American market for home consumption after being a popular arcade game in North America in 1986 when it was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, almost 2 years after the original arcade release. In America, on a funny note, even though it was published by Capcom themselves in Japan and many other parts of the world, in North America specifically, it was published, so to speak, brought to arcades by the successful American company, Williams Entertainment, which was big in the pinball game, and they were also technically kind of sort of the owners and publishers of most Midway games. As a matter of fact, at some point in the 90s, Williams and Midway became indistinguishable. It was just Midway after that. 1942 was originally designed by a Cap by the name of Yoshiki Okamoto, who before working for Capcom had actually worked for Konami, most notably on the arcade games Time Pilot and Gyrus. So he was already well versed in the shmup, the shoot 'em up genre. He would go on to design this major arcade hit for Capcom, 1942, and then of course the sequel we're watching right now, 1943. He also was involved with the games Gunsmoke, Sidearms, and Forgotten Worlds, all shooters of some sort or another. So that was really kind of his thing. Boom! Look at that. And later on, he would produce such Capcom hits as Final Fight and Street Fighter II, and he would later become involved in the production of the original Resident Evil. That's level 1 down. Now, for those who don't know, 1942 is a simpler game than this. They're very similar. Obviously, 1943 is a graphical update. Maybe the music and sound are a bit better, since especially the NES port of 1942, the music, if you want to call it that, is very repetitive and maybe a little annoying. Even though it's classic, it's just, you know, literally like beep, 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 beep. You know, it's just a bunch of beeps and drums. Now this game, 1943, it was originally released in arcades June 1987, and the home Nintendo Entertainment System port would come to life. Another popular home NES game for Capcom in 1988, about a year later. And one of the things, the major thing besides graphics that this game brings to the table is, even though it's not as crazy as many games that were inspired by this would get, as you can see, you can upgrade the weaponry pretty well. You have some nice bombs, lightning, fucking blitz, whatever attack, bomb attacks. It's more diverse, maybe a slightly more diverse set of enemies, maybe slightly smarter enemy patterns than 1942. It's definitely repetitive, but that's the thing. Shooters are, beat 'em ups are. A lot of arcade games, especially old school arcade games, were all about repetition, because the goal wasn't to sit and relax at home playing this kind of shit like, you know, people today are used to. In the arcade, you were standing up, you were on edge, it was excitement, there was noise going on all around you, lights and colors. And the point was really, the repetition was what you wanted in arcade games back then, because it was all about Twitch gaming. It was all about getting good at the game and seeing how far you could get in the game, especially on one quarter or, you know, one credit. Level 2 in the can. 100% destroyed. Look at that shit. Now, the NES port of this game actually included a slight update or improvement to the gameplay with the ability to permanently upgrade your weapons, so long provided that you didn't die. If you could stay alive, if you were good enough to not die, you could keep the better weapons. And that was something that would carry over into a lot of other games, a lot of other shmups like this that were heavily inspired by 1942 and 1943. Speaking of which, this game had a different alternate version, kind of a more bizarro world version of 1943 called 1943 Kai that was released in arcades. It's a bit more rare. It was later ported to the PC Engine, known in America as the TurboGrafx-16, a very good system that, especially in America, was well known for its shooter games. The difference between Kai and the original 1943 is mainly just little bizarre shit like planes that shoot laser beams in the 1940s or ships that can run on land, just weird stuff like that. It was really just kind of an alternate weird take, kind of a more extreme hard mode version of 1943. Yoshiki Okamoto would actually be involved with one more sequel, direct sequel, the third game, which was actually not it was a prequel, at least in concept, 1941 Counterattack, which came out in 1990, and it was only ported to the Super Graphics, which was a Japanese update to the PC Engine, in 1991. There would be two further sequels that were considerably updated as far as weapon diversity, more diversity in enemies and level types. Mission complete. And, of course, graphics and sound. And those were 19XX, War Against Destiny, which was released in 1996, and 1944, The Loop Master, which was released in 2000, and that was actually one of Capcom's last arcade shooters. Similar games to this. I played this in the arcades. I played this and 1942 both at different places as a kid in the arcades. There was a skating rink I've mentioned in the past that I probably played one of these at. I definitely played this game at the local Pizza Hut arcade. It's entirely possible that 1943 was a bigger hit than 1942. Don't quote me on that, but I remember seeing 1943 in arcades far more often than 1942. And I certainly enjoyed this game, what little I was able to play it. Of course, you gotta understand, as a kid, I didn't get to play arcades that much, so I enjoyed anything I could fucking get my hands on, even if it was some game that was the type of game I would have very little interest in or be very bad at, I would still sit there and watch the attract screens and shit like that. But I would still try to play every game that I could. I was obsessed with games, fueled largely by the fact that my grandmother didn't give me quarters very often to play them. So when I was able to play an arcade game, granted, I wouldn't last long because I didn't have the fucking experience. But I ate it up. I enjoyed it. And 1943 was no exception. There were later games very similar to this, directly inspired by this, that I encountered that I enjoyed more. They were actually all SNK Neo Geo arcade titles. The first of which was also at that local Pizza Hut. It was called Ghost Pilots. And it was basically the same thing, just more diversity in levels. It may have been set in Vietnam, although don't quote me on that. It might have been set in World War II also. Boom! Tidal waves. It had a strange gimmick where you could get little side planes next to you. Little ghost planes, hence the title. That gave you extra firepower. It was something similar that had been done in the past in, I think, like Galaga and whatnot. Round clear. Boom. May you fight bravely. The game most similar to this, the shoot 'em up that actually went on to become probably my favorite in this genre. Certainly the most my favorite in this vertical scrolling style was another SNK game developed by Video Systems called Aero Fighters, and most specifically Aero Fighters 2. Aero Fighters 1 was released in 1992. 2 years later, I encountered Aero Fighters 2 at a local All the Best Video. Had a few arcade games near their game center setup that they had. And they actually had two games that I absolutely fell in love with, even though I had already encountered the previous installments, and that was Samurai Showdown 2, which became one of my favorite fighting games of all time, and Aero Fighters 2, which, you know, the original Aero Fighters is a great game, very fun, really builds on this formula a lot. Aero Fighters 2 kind of took it up a notch, turned it up to 11, was a lot kookier, exemplified by the fact that my favorite pilot was a dolphin that flies the fucking plane, which, of course, you know, by now you've seen my Aero Fighter playthrough with old Chris. Oh, look, see? There you go. I guess Ghost Pilot took that concept from this game, having extra planes. But yeah, Aero Fighters 2 was great, and that was the one I played the most. I would later get a chance to play Aero Fighter 3 in arcades, but kind of similar to like Samurai Showdown 3 and 4. I just was never more in love with the sequels than I was those. Like Samurai Showdown 2 and Aero Fighters 2 were it, as far as I'm concerned, with those series. Jeez, yeah, see, shit's starting to turn, the heat's starting to turn up here. I mean, you can forgive the repetition of these games. 1942 and 1943, a lot of it is just level after level. You blow up a bunch of planes, you go down, blow up a fucking aircraft carrier, next level, same shit. But you can forgive that repetition and kind of lack of creativity because, again, back then it wasn't about giving you this big, diverse experience. Because you have to remember that offering a lot of diversity in a game gives you replay value and replayability at home more than it does in the arcade. That isn't to say that diversity in enemy designs or level designs or weaponry is a bad thing. That's certainly still a good thing in the arcades. But these arcade games were designed first and foremost to make money and to eat your quarters, but also you wanted them to be repetitious. You wanted to do a lot of the same thing because the more you do that same or similar thing, the better you get at it. And that is why in that so-called golden age of the arcades in the 80s, you had all of these classic type of games like Galaga, like Asteroids, Pac-Man, 1942, you know, fucking Ladybug and Tempest, Rolling Thunder, etc. You had all of these games that you did the same or similar thing over and over and over, and you got better at it and better at it. And the challenge would just ramp up. You'd be doing the same thing in later levels, but it would be harder. It would be progressively harder. There'd be more enemies, harder enemies. They'd be faster. They'd shoot more bullets, whatever. And you had to get better and better and better to advance. These games weren't really about, you know, experiencing a story or seeing an ending. It was about getting a high score. It was about getting good at the game and taking pride and satisfaction in the fact that you got better at the game and you were kicking the game's ass. Could you put your initials in the high score so that other players would see, hey, this guy kicks ass, this girl kicks ass, you know? It's the same concept as online games that have leaderboards now. But back then, I would honestly argue that it meant more going into your local arcade and seeing your initials in the top 10 or the top 5 or the top 3. If you were good enough at a game to have the top score on that specific machine at that specific spot, like that was your turf, that was your territory. But, you know, as you can see, I'm decent. I'm decent at 1943. It was a game that I did play probably more than others. I would say arcade games that I actually got to play on a semi-regular basis compared to the ones that I never really got to play would include this. Before I was a teenager and got to play them all the time, as long as I had tokens, would probably be like 1943. I played a decent amount of Rampage. I played a fair amount of the original Ninja Turtles arcade game, which is funny because I wasn't allowed to watch the cartoon. Of course, I played Street Fighter 2 whenever I possibly could because I was fucking obsessed with it. And my obsession was fueled by the fact that I was rarely ever able to play it. And I had magazines. I remember having a Game Pro that had a bunch of like fighting and combo lists for characters, and I would sit there and plan out in my head how I was gonna get good. I was gonna play the game whenever I could, and I was gonna practice these moves, and I was gonna get good. I was gonna beat the game and beat other players. Of course, I didn't get to do that as much as I wanted, but sadly, I never became the master of the original Street Fighter 2 as much as I wanted to because I just didn't get to play it very often. I had been super excited when I heard that the NES was going to get a port of it, but it never wound up getting that port. And I didn't get a Super Nintendo until holidays 1995, by which point, you know, Super Street Fighter 2 and Turbo had come and gone. Street Fighter Alpha 1 was out, you know. X-Men and Darkstalkers were out. There's a whole different ballgame. I got to play those games a ton. But you know, 1991, 1992 up through fucking 1994. Like, or even 5. Like, yeah, the Street Fighter 2, the arcade game, and Championship Edition, and Hyper Fighting were my holy grail because I didn't get to play them much. Look at that! A mission aborted. How shameful. How fucking shameful. We're gonna take another crack at it. But yeah, I wouldn't say by any means that 1942 or 1943 are among my favorite games. But it is fair to say that they have a special place in my heart because of nostalgia, because I used to see them and play them once in a while in the arcades. Another arcade game I remember playing that honestly wasn't great, and it got a NES port that I didn't really play, was a boxing game called Ring King. For some reason, I got to play that. I also tried my hand at Bump and Jump, although I wasn't very good at it because I didn't get to play it very often. Those are games I remember. I remember Double Dragon 1 or 2 being at Pizza Hut at some point. That arcade at Pizza Hut seemed to circulate games fairly often. Like, once it got Street Fighter, that was so popular that that kind of stayed put. But and I think Turtles stayed put for a long time because it had a cross promotion with it had a cross promotion with Pizza Hut at the time. But yeah, they would cycle through. It was kind of a good thing and a bad thing because games I liked would go away and I wouldn't get to see them anymore. I wouldn't have a chance to play them anymore. But then they would also cycle in new games that I was able to experience. And that was fun. That was a good thing. That was cool because how the hell else? I didn't live in a place that had a bunch of arcades. You know, it was the kind of deal where like once a year I would go to the local county fair and they would have a big arcade tent that I would, you know, beg my grandmother to be able to go check out even though she wanted me to be there for different reasons. And that was always exciting for me. Or any rare time I'd get to go to the mall or something like that, I'd get to see arcade games that I didn't usually get to see. But like my two, as a kid and into my preteens, the two places that I was most liable to see arcade games were that local Pizza Hut and a local skating rink. Both of which, you know, tended to get newish games, and they cycled through shit pretty often. So I did get experience with a bunch of games. That's the skating rink was actually where I first encountered World Heroes, another SNK fighter. But, you know, I definitely loved the arcades as a kid. For young people who never really got to experience that, you had to be there. When arcades existed and really mattered, that was a different time. It was a good time, in my view, because you had things... There was crossover, there was home ports and all that shit. But you really had, like, as a gamer, you had so many options back then. As far as completely different types of gaming. You had computer games that were totally their own thing for the most part. You had home games like Super Mario Brothers and Sonic the Hedgehog, etc. that were their own thing. And then you had the arcades, which, as I said, often got home ports, but not always. A lot of arcade games, until like the mid to late 90s, you just wouldn't see home ports of. And you had, you know, sit-down racing machines and all these shoot-'em-ups, and you had fighting games where really playing with this joystick and buttons was the superior way to play. That was the way to go. And they were three very different experiences in gaming that brought their own very different and very unique, valuable aspects to the table. And I got to experience, to some extent, all three. I would say I got to experience computer gaming less because we didn't have a good computer to run games until the early 90s. So I missed out on that. But I still got a taste I still got a taste of PC gaming. But arcades, as much as I loved my Nintendo, I was still obsessed with arcades. If I could have been able to spend all day in an arcade as a kid, I would have done that. Because that was just fucking magic to me. It was absolute magic. And, you know, even if I had no money, if my grandmother had allowed me to just hang out for hours at an arcade, even though she didn't give me any money to actually play anything, I would have been thrilled to watch other people play games. I would have been thrilled to sit there and just hang out in that atmosphere and enjoy the ambiance and watch the attract modes and shit like that. Talk to other kids and other people about the games. I still would have fucking had a blast just doing that. That's how much I fucking loved arcades as a kid. So anyways, 1943, Arcade Memories. It's a good game. If you've never played it, check it out. It's hard. Prepare to shoot stuff. Prepare to get shot. See you next time.
シューティングゲーム1943